A little over 150 years ago, one of Cambridge's graduates, Charles Darwin, published the theory of evolution by natural selection, one of the most disruptive ideas in the history of human thought. But since then, rather than cherish this planet, our home, its diversity, fragility and beauty, we've only too often continued to treat it with contempt. Today, as a consequence, we face disaster on a global scale. The climate stability of the past 12,000 years has come to an end, and around the world we are now suffering from the impact. At the same time, nature is declining at rates unprecedented in human history, with as many as 1 million species facing extinction. We're running out of time. If we do not take dramatic action, we will witness irreversible damage to our natural world and risk the collapse of our societies. But there's still hope. If we all, every single one of us, take our share of responsibility for the future of life on Earth. And that is why Cambridge Zero is so important.
We are running out of time. If we do not take dramatic action, we will witness irreversible damage to our natural world and risk the collapse of our societies. The great Cambridge alumnus, Sir David Attenborough. I'm Stephen Toope, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and I welcome you to this finale of our 30th Alumni Festival. There can be no doubt that 2020 is a year of catastrophes, a year of disaster on a global scale. COVID-19, of course, dominates our airways for obvious reasons. But the year commenced with fires in Australia blanketing much of the continent in smoke and burning 18.6 million hectares, killing 34 people directly and destroying or displacing as many as 3 billion animals. Meanwhile, in neighboring Indonesia, floods killed 66 people, while at least 60,000 lost their homes. Plagues of locusts are devouring crops across Africa and parts of Asia. As I speak, wildfires rage in California and Oregon, and this is perhaps even more terrifying, are still burning in Siberia months after they began, and as far north as the Arctic Circle. A fifth of India's districts are experiencing drought, even as floods have devastated other parts of the country and neighboring Bangladesh. This is only the tip of the metaphorical iceberg, although even that metaphor is becoming ironic as icebergs themselves melt and our sea levels rise. This has been a year of disaster, with so many disasters directly linked to the actions of human beings, of us, including COVID-19 itself. With so many disasters linked to the carbon we've released into the Earth's atmosphere, with so many disasters linked to global warming, we human beings have caused this mess. But as Sir David says, there's still hope if we all, every single one of us, take our share of responsibility for the future of the Earth. As individuals, as businesses, as governments, and as communities, we have only one option, and that is to lower the amount of carbon we're releasing into our atmosphere. To bring that about, there are crucial choices we must make in order, and I am not being alarmist, in order to save our planet. As a university, Cambridge has made a choice, becoming the first in the world to adopt a 1.5 degree centigrade science-based target for carbon reduction. And last year, we established Cambridge Zero, taking our talent and convening power and connecting the incredible work already being done across the university with partners who are leading the way in every sphere all around the world. Our researchers are collaborating across the collegiate university and combining every element of our considerable academic power to find the solutions our planet desperately needs. We at Cambridge are doing all that we can, but it needs all of us, each and every person and each and every organization, to make the right choices. Another brilliant, inspirational Cambridge graduate, Jane Goodall, says, "You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make." Well, here to help us understand the scale of the climate challenge and the choices we must make, I welcome today's panel. After our discussion, we will answer as many of your questions as we can, and please feel free to submit them at any time by typing them at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Emily Shuckburgh is the director of Cambridge Zero. An alumna of Trinity College, she's a mathematician and climate scientist, a fellow of Darwin College and the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, an associate fellow of the Centre for Science and Policy, and a fellow of the British Antarctic Survey. Based in Bangladesh, Professor Salim Ouk is the director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development and a senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Helen Clarkson is a graduate of Corpus Christi and joined the Climate Group in 2017 as its chief executive officer. Helen was formerly at Forum for the Future and before that at Médecins Sans Frontières, where she worked on humanitarian missions to countries including Sudan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. And finally, Ella Parker, who recently graduated from Fitzwilliam College. Ella has been undertaking an internship at Cambridge Zero prior to commencing a Master of Science in Climate Change and Environmental Policy at the University of Leeds. Welcome to all of the panelists. Well, we've had a few apparently good news stories coming out of the beginning of the current COVID crisis, with the lowering of air pollution, cleaner rivers running through our cities. But of course, the pandemic itself is probably linked to our climate crisis. What's causing the rapid changes, and what must we do as societies and institutions to redress this climate crisis? Let's start with you, Emily.
Oh, thank you, Vice-Chancellor. So, I mean, if we look at our atmosphere today, if we look at the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere today, it's at absolutely unprecedented levels. It's the highest it's been for at least 1 million years, probably for 15 million years. And that means that the air that we're breathing in today, all of us, has higher levels of carbon dioxide in it than the air that any of our forebears have ever breathed in. And that increase in carbon dioxide has come about as a result of human activities, primarily the burning of fossil fuels for energy, deforestation, cutting down trees around the world, and industrial processes. And we know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and therefore will warm the atmosphere. And that's what we've been seeing. Temperatures are around about 1 degree Celsius warmer than they were at the end of the 19th century. And as you were describing, Vice-Chancellor, we're seeing those impacts of that warming around the world in terms of increased risk of flooding, in terms of increased heat waves, the wildfires that you mentioned that are causing devastation in many parts of the world right now at this moment. But there's also a really severe risk into the future. If we continue to emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as we are now, the warming will increase, the risk of those extreme weather events will only increase still further. And really importantly, we start to get into the risk of irreversible changes. David Attenborough mentioned in his introductory video the risk of extinction of species. We're also at risk of losing the vast ice sheets that cover Greenland and West Antarctica. These things would be irreversible if they occurred. But the really important point around climate change is that it is both a global crisis that is both predictable and preventable. And it's preventable because we can prevent it and the worst extremes of the impacts by cutting our carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. But we have to do so at an unprecedented rate and at an unprecedented scale. So if we were to have a reasonable chance of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which, as you mentioned, is where we as the university have linked our emissions reductions to, we would need globally to around about halve our emissions over the next decade, and then to reach net zero emissions by the middle of the century. That's a really ambitious task, but it's doable. And it's doable if we take decisions here and now today, if we invest in the research and development that will drive the innovations that will help us create a stronger, healthier, more resilient, more sustainable world in the coming decades. So I think it's a story of both fear and hope at the same time.
Exactly. There is hope here, and we're going to come back to that, Emily. But Salim, I'd like to come to you next. We've seen, obviously, in the COVID crisis that the pandemic has affected disproportionately the most vulnerable communities and societies. But climate change does exactly the same thing in your home, Bangladesh, and thank you for joining us. Climate change is already an emergency. It's not about something that's going to happen. It's happening now. We've seen entire nations having to adapt quickly to COVID. Are there any lessons that we could learn from this current crisis, measures that we could put in place which would actually begin to address the climate crisis in as clear and present a fashion as Emily's indicated is required? Over to you, Salim.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts. So first of all, let me congratulate Cambridge University for adopting the 1.5 target and the net zero emissions goal that you have. This is very much needed. But as you said, unfortunately, 2020, this year, is not just the year of COVID-19, but is also the year in which human-induced climate change is now occurring. And you cited a number of examples around the world. Here in my part of the world, in Bangladesh, a few months ago, we were hit by a super cyclone, Amphan, which was not caused by climate change, but its intensity made it a super cyclone because of elevated sea surface temperatures. And in previous decades, super cyclones of this magnitude have killed tens of thousands of people. But in this case, the number of deaths were minimized because Bangladesh has one of the best cyclone warning and shelter provision. We were successful in evacuating more than 2.5 million people who took shelter during the cyclone. And although it did a lot of damage, it didn't kill many people as it would have done in the past. So adaptation to the impacts of climate change is a reality that we are facing in Bangladesh. And I will provide 3 opportunities for us to collaborate across the globe between us. The first one would be from university to university. In Bangladesh, we have a platform called Gobeshona, which is a Bangla word for research, where we have brought together 50 plus universities and research institutions which are collaborating on dealing with the impacts of climate change, predominantly on adaptation, but we also have programs on mitigation and reducing our emissions, because we should be doing that as well. And we also have networks of universities in the South Asia region, and also a network across the least developed countries, which are 50 of the poorest countries, most vulnerable countries in Asia and Africa. So in these universities, we are working on, particularly on community-based adaptation with the most vulnerable communities in our most vulnerable countries. And we are learning a lot on how to adapt, and we are very interested in sharing that, both at the faculty, research, academic level, but even more importantly, at the young youth university students level, where the youth of the world can come together. And you may know that yesterday was the day of action of the Fridays for Future global program, which has a very active chapter in Bangladesh across the country. And they had a lot of actions here in Bangladesh. And the theme for that was most affected people and areas, of which Bangladesh will certainly count as one of the top countries in which we have many millions of affected people. So collaboration across the north-south divide, as it were, for a common goal. On the one hand, reducing emissions for the big emitters. On the other hand, adapting to the impacts which are now global. And indeed, the final point I'll make is an opportunity for the developed world, the rich countries who are now suffering the impacts of climate change that they didn't think they would have to suffer, but they are suffering. We can actually share our knowledge from Bangladesh on how to deal with the impacts of climate change, because we've learned a lot on how to do that. And we would be very happy to share knowledge, not just north to south, but south to north. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. And that's hugely important, obviously, that we actually share what we're learning as we go along. Helen, at the Climate Group, I know that you work closely with a lot of multinational commercial entities. Tell me, what do you think zero means for business? Are you seeing yet the genuine changes in the sector that are going to be required? Tell me a little bit about the scale of change that's taking place in the business community.
Yeah, so the Climate Group's a non-profit organisation, so we're mission driven, and our mission is to drive climate action fast. And we look at net zero by the mid-century with greater prosperity for all. And we do that as an organisation by working with businesses and with governments and bringing groups of organisations together in big networks and coalitions which have very ambitious targets in the middle. And we use that to shift markets and shift policy. So we have something called the RE100 campaign, which has almost 250 big corporate members committed to 100% renewable energy. And we bring them together both to help them achieve that target. We do a lot of reporting on whether they're getting there. But we can also then show policymakers that there's these huge demand signals and use that to help shape their policy. And we see a lot that is going on that's good. We're getting new members to our campaigns. We're seeing companies hit their commitments ahead of time. What we find is that if companies set an ambitious target, it sends a really clear internal signal within the company that then drives innovation. And you often find companies hitting their targets ahead of time. One of the other things we do is run something called Climate Week NYC, which is just coming to an end now. And this year we moved a lot of that online and managed to reach a huge global audience through running that as a virtual event. It's normally in person in New York with some online aspects, but mostly it was virtual this year, and we ended up having over 500 events as part of Climate Week. And it's also a moment when corporates often come forward with their big announcements. So starting with the biggest company in the world, we had a huge announcement from Walmart this week targeting zero emissions from its global operations by 2040 and plans to secure enough wind, solar and other renewable energy to power its facilities with 100% green power by 2035. Microsoft made an announcement that we're going not only carbon negative by 2030, but water positive as well. So cutting the company's consumption. And then, British companies as well. We work with BT on something called the Electric Vehicles Coalition. It changed name really, but it's the Electric Vehicles Fleets Coalition, which is all about looking at next year's COP talks that are going to happen in the UK. They're the big UN talks. They move around. They're going to be in the UK next year. And the government that hosts that is supposed to show real leadership. So we're working with British companies like BT to push the government to adopt much earlier adoption dates for fully electric vehicles. And Tesco's joined this week. So another huge British company. And there was actually an advert in the Telegraph and Times, I think this week on Tuesday, from those big companies, Unilever and others joining, asking the government to show real leadership on this. So that's how we work at this intersection between policies and markets. And big businesses really are a very active part of the economy in terms of cutting carbon and setting really ambitious goals and following through.
Thanks very much. That's obviously encouraging because, again, it's going to be crucial that the private sector plays the role that it needs to play in making all of this happen. We're going to come back to that later with some other questions. But Ella, I'd like to turn it over to you for a second now. I gather that you've had the opportunity to attend a number of sessions during the Alumni Festival, many, of course, focused on climate change issues. Could you tell us what were some of the things you found most interesting, good takeaways?
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, it's been amazing to attend a lot of the alumni sessions this week. It's been amazing to see the breadth and the depth of the university's research on climate change. Um, I think something that I found most interesting was that a common idea came up in two of the talks that I watched. So one of those talks was the nature-based solutions talk. That was really interesting because it was talking about the amazing co-benefits for people, for biodiversity, for climate change mitigation that nature-based solutions can provide. But it really emphasised that it wasn't an alternative to reducing emissions. It wasn't a magical solution. And this was interesting because it came up in the climate repair talk as well, where again it was discussed how important it was that we research climate repair and carbon drawdown. But again, it wasn't an alternative to reducing emissions. It needed to be alongside. And a really nice metaphor that I liked a lot that they used was that you wouldn't empty the bath without turning off the tap. And that stuck with me. I think the other thing that I found really interesting was at the food talk. I personally, as a consumer, sometimes find it really hard to kind of weigh up with packaging, with air miles, and with the actual food itself to try and work out what the best option was. But Andrew Barnford was really clear and really concise that it's always what the food is that's the most important thing. So that's kind of avoiding rudimentary meats and living a more plant-based diet. So yeah, for me, I found that personally really helpful. But those were just the things at the top of my head. There were so many interesting things said.
Those are great. Those are great and actually really clear takeaways. So it's always helpful to have something that comes out of this that you can actually act on. We'll come back to that. Before I go on, though, Ella, tell me a little bit about your experience as an intern with Cambridge Zero. What were you working on, and what did you find? I hope a bit inspiring about it.
Yeah, so I've been very lucky getting to intern at Cambridge Zero for the last 8 weeks. It's been really amazing to get to intern at the organisation when it's still so new. As was said, it was only created last year, so it's been really exciting to see how it's been evolving and how fast-paced it is. So part of my role was creating an overview of the research output of the university, and that was really amazing to see personally because it's quite useful to think about what I wanted to go into after my master's. Also, it was really heartening to see all these different academics in such different fields, with so many different methods as well, trying to work towards the same goal of addressing climate change. And I actually found that really inspiring for myself and what I want to go into to addressing that goal as well.
Well, that's great. Well, good luck with the master's degree. That's the next step, I know. Um, Helen mentioned, of course, that there's going to be a very important conference called a Conference of the Parties, COP26, under the Climate Change Convention. It's going to be taking place in Glasgow this later next year. Emily, I know that Cambridge is a very active part of the COP26 universities network. What are the expectations that you have of the conference? What can be achieved there? And how can Cambridge make a difference in trying to push for success? Emily.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Yes. So, well, as you say, this big climate conference was supposed to actually happen this year and has been postponed by a year because of the current COVID crisis. So it will now happen in November 2021. But we're already starting to see some of the really important announcements because one of the biggest things around this conference is countries around the world hopefully substantially increasing their pledges in terms of emissions reductions. And just this last week, we heard from China that they are pledging to become carbon neutral by 2060, which is a very welcome development. And so the first thing is that we are very hopeful and would very much like to encourage other countries come forward with ambitious targets as well. And it's not just those big overarching targets, it's also then looking down at what that means in terms of real changes. And again, we've been hearing some announcements already about the sorts of progress that we would be hoping there. So we've had a recent announcement from California about bringing forward the date for phasing out of petrol and diesel cars in California to 2035. If we saw similar announcements from other parts of the world as well, that would be very welcome. Similarly, in terms of phasing out the use of coal for energy production, or the reductions in deforestation. And equally important, and I'm sure that Salim will comment on this, is looking at the aspects of ensuring that countries are able to adapt to the climate change that they, that they're already experiencing and will only experience more of, and making sure that we are treating this as a global problem and supporting it as a global problem and addressing it as a global problem. So that I think there's a lot of ambition and a lot of hope that we might be able to try to turn the corner here, as we absolutely have to in terms of our emissions, and start heading in the direction of net zero by the middle of the century, protecting ourselves from the worst of the impacts of climate change.
Thanks a lot. Ella mentioned a couple of ways in which she had been able to take ideas away from the Alumni Festival about things that she could do or think about it as an individual. And I'd like to pursue that a little bit, because as Jane Goodall said in the quote that I offered at the beginning of the session, on a personal level, each one of us is making choices every day that have an impact on climate change. Some of them are big decisions if we're in certain types of positions. Some are just small everyday decisions. So they're all going to have an impact, and Jane Goodall said, let's make the choices that make the right kind of difference and not the wrong kind. If you each could identify an important choice that we all must make, each one of us, what would we consider? What should we consider, and what should the choice be? Why don't I start with you, Helen?
Great, it's good to go first. I was worried someone would pick mine. So I would start with meat. I think when you say to people, look, really, you've got to cut down your meat consumption, there's a sort of recoil about kind of, can be like, well, don't tell me what to do, and they think you're saying you've got to go vegan, and I'm not saying that. Actually, I think there are really good ways to hugely cut down your meat consumption in a way that isn't that too much of a hardship. So I like the phrase meat's a treat. Thinking of it like that, I would start with cutting it out at lunchtime. So, there are plenty other sandwich choices. I know we're not all going to Pret anymore. We hear a lot about that, but there's lots of other things you can eat. So cut it there. Then start to think about cutting it out midweek. And by getting into it that way and thinking about it as a treat or something you use for flavor, not the main point of each meal, I think you can really cut back your meat consumption. And it's so detrimental to the planet. The amount of meat that we eat and the amount of water and everything that goes into production, that's something that can have a really real impact. And there was a really good guide from the Lancet last year, which was about the health of people and the health of the planet, and bringing those two things together. I think that's a really good starting point. So I would recommend that. And then for those people who are employers, think about, can you use your expenses policy to guide some of that? We took, as a climate organisation, we sort of go quite early on these things, and took meat out of our expenses policy. That's one thing you can do. But just thinking about that in your kind of work canteens, maybe, and provisions and things like that. So I think meat is a good place for people to start.
Thanks very much. Great, clear example. Salim, what would you say?
Thank you very much. So I would offer that every single one of us on planet Earth needs to think of ourselves as, on the one hand, being part of the problem because of the emissions that we are responsible for, but also want to be part of the solution. And in that context, what I suggest we think about of ourselves, every single one of us, as citizens of planet Earth first, and not citizens of our particular country. And in this global challenge, which climate change is, it's a global challenge, not a national challenge, we need to be linking up together. And in my view, the most important cohort that we need to have linked up together are young people. And that's where institutions like yours and mine, universities come in. We have a lot of very, very bright young people. And what I would like to offer to the young people at Cambridge University and other universities in the United Kingdom is think of yourselves as global citizens and link up with the victims of your pollution. And I don't want your money. I do want you to extend your solidarity. And if you want to know who they are, get in touch with me and I'll put you in touch with them and let's solve the problem together. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's wonderful. Ella, what about you? Is there anything else that you would add as a specific thing that we should be thinking about?
So I always think about structural changes as the most important. So that's using your vote and supporting policies. I think that's the thing I would emphasize and that I find sometimes gets lost in personal discussions. So yeah, thinking about votes and policies.
Great, thank you. You earlier, Emily, did use the word hope as you were finishing your first intervention. I know that you've been working on these issues for decades now, and you can easily become overwhelmed and a little bit depressed, if I may say, about the state of the planet and the state of our ability, to Ella's point, to make the kinds of decisions we seem to have to make from a policy perspective. Do you nonetheless remain optimistic, Emily, on your good days?
I think that on your good days may be an important qualifier, because sometimes, I mean, we've actually just, I spent a lot of time studying the polar regions, and we've just been hearing the latest news of the state of the sea ice in the Arctic this year. It gets to its minimum extent at the end of the summer, and it's looking like it's just hit its lowest level, likely to be in the second lowest level we've ever seen in the records. So that's not exactly great news. But I think the thing that does give me hope and optimism is the things that actually Ella mentioned, looking around the university at all the exciting research and innovation that is going on in many different departments of the university, and in some instances really leading to transformational developments that will really help us as a society move towards a zero carbon world. And so if I'm optimistic, it's primarily because of that, because I see the excitement and the energy and the enthusiasm, and that in itself is inspiring. And maybe to just return to the question that you asked the other panelists, I mean, I absolutely agree with the importance of collaboration amongst different people in different countries and different groups of society, and especially about inspiring our young people in that direction. But I think that it's, you know, that those aspects of inspiring everyone to help use all their influence, however large or small that is, to work towards a positive future, and a future that we can be then proud of leaving to future generations as our legacy. That, I think, is very much the goal of what we're trying to do with Cambridge Zero, and it's certainly my personal goal as well.
That's great. Well, you will not be surprised to learn that there are many questions that have been coming in as you've been chatting. I'm just going to answer a whole series of questions very quickly, because not surprisingly, quite a few of you have been asking about Cambridge and its own commitments around potential divestment from the fossil fuel industry in our endowment, and also relationships with fossil fuel companies and others in the industry. Let me say that there are actually a lot of things happening on those fronts right now. And in fact, we have a committee that has to consider all of the philanthropy and research contracts from an ethical and reputational standpoint before we are willing to take money from organizations. That committee has in fact been looking at the whole question of climate change, and it's recently given a report to our university council, which was ratified by council, seeking to align our whole approach around research funding, both philanthropic and contracts, with the university's climate change commitments. So that's a new step for Cambridge, and it is going to result in changing relationships with a whole series of external entities, not just fossil fuel companies, I have to say. We are going to be looking to assess whether or not we think that the relationship is moving in the right direction, is aligned with Cambridge policies on climate change or not. So that's a big step. I'm also delighted to report that the Council has just received a major report on pros and cons of divestment from fossil fuel in relation to our endowment fund. And there will be very important announcements made very soon by the university. In fact, I'll be making some of them. I don't want to give that away, but early in October, expect to hear something. So I wanted to get that out of the way before I go back to other questions. One of the questions comes from an alumna of Trinity Hall who's in the UK, and she says that it seems as if individuals, and now in some senses corporations and certainly civil society, is committed to making the important changes necessary to address climate change. She wonders whether we think government is up to the task. Is government really making the decisions that are needed? Ella, you started by saying voting was important and policies. Can I just ask for your thoughts on that? Do you feel inspired by what you're hearing from government?
I think a question of political willpower is obviously important here, and that's why I'm saying I think it's so important to show your support and vote for policies and show your support for policies, because if it's shown that there is support for those type of policies, then obviously my hope is that government and political institutions will follow that. So I think I have hope because people are obviously so much more engaged, and I can only hope that there's that chain reaction coming.
Thank you. What about you, Salim? Looking at it from a global south perspective, do you think that governments in the global south are also able to make the decisions required?
Absolutely. So let me give you a couple of examples. Firstly, for the most vulnerable countries that I mentioned earlier, all of the most vulnerable countries, about 50 of them across the global south, have committed to reducing emissions to zero by 2050. And they did this back in COP22, which was the year after the Paris Agreement, before anybody else did. And these are the poorest, most vulnerable countries in the world who are taking moral leadership. They are saying, we are going to do it because it's the right thing to do, and we want everybody else to follow us. Unfortunately, everybody else has not followed in due course. They are different countries doing different things. But the most recent example that we just heard about from China, in my view, is a very, very big game changer. China has now decided, and they make a big difference, that they are going to enter and race to the fossil fuel free world that we need to get to as fast as possible. And they're going to be a champion for that. And they are a game changer. If they decide to do that, the rest of the world will inevitably have to follow them. So I have great faith that it will happen. So far, unfortunately, it hasn't happened. We are late, and we are seeing the impacts of climate change that are due to our failure to do that. But I remain optimistic that the changes will occur and that governments will meet the challenge. Inevitably, they will be forced to do it, but I hope that they will do it quicker than late.
Thanks, Salim. We have a question from a Downing alumnus who's in the UK and Italy, and this person is asking about technological innovation and the role that that is going to play in addressing climate change. But the point that's being made is it takes time for innovations to work their way through the system to actually become scaled and effective. I'm curious, Helen, from your optic into the private sector, Are we moving fast enough with the innovation that's required to address climate change?
Yeah, I think a lot of the innovation is there. I think what you then need, and this is why I talk about the sort of markets and policy working together, is you need good policy that allows the shifts in the markets that we need to see. And that's why we talk about things like the end dates for electric vehicle, for diesel and petrol vehicles, right? Because you need to send a signal into the market that you will not be able to sell those after a certain date. And the sooner you can get that, the more you stimulate the market for electric vehicles. And we've seen that date been set at 2040 by a lot of governments, but it's moving forward. As Emily mentioned, California this week talked about 2035. In the UK, we're pushing for 2030 with the Fleets Coalition that I mentioned. In the UK, in markets like that, over 50% of vehicles are actually bought by corporates for their fleet. So if you can switch the fleet market, you then stimulate the second-hand market and you get this trickle down. That's one example of the electric vehicle market, but that's sort of going on in other bits of the economy as well. And that's why we work really hard on these demand signals. The innovations I think that we really need are the bits that are really not very exciting to the kind of average person. It's the cement sector, steel sector, plastics, heavy industry, called often in climate world hard to abate. It's very hard to abate the emissions there, which is why there's a lot of early focus on things like the energy system, where you can, transition right now with the prices that we have. So in those sectors, there's a mixture of energy efficiency that you can do, but you do also need innovation in the processes to get the carbon out. And I think we need to see more innovation there, and that's why we need to use processes like the COP process, where governments set out a leadership standard and use that to create the policies that we need.
Thanks. Emily, there's a more precise question around technology as well we've received, which is really focusing on the possibility of reversing effects of carbon in the atmosphere already. Sometimes that's historically been called climate repair, and some people call it geoengineering. How much of a contribution do you think that can make? One of the questions here was, is this really possible, and is it dangerous? And so your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, so that tends to cover a whole host of different things. So one thing that we may very well need to do is find ways of actively taking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere to try and bring the levels of those greenhouse gases down low enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Now, of course, we have natural ways of doing that. A tree soaks up carbon dioxide, and so there are ways in which we can look to be using nature to try and help us do that. Actually, another really important aspect of that is soils. Soils store a huge amount of carbon dioxide in them as well. And so part of this is about looking at technological solutions. Part of it's looking to see how we can use nature to help in those solutions. But all of those, as you mentioned, come with significant considerations in terms of the unintended consequences. So if we look at any of the technologies that are sometimes explored in terms of this, they can have significant impacts in terms of, for example, the land use that's required for them, or the amount of water that's required. Similarly, if we're using nature, it can have something that you could do to try and enhance you could plant forests everywhere. If you plant all the same trees, that's not going to be very good for biodiversity. So you have to consider all those trade-offs when you're considering those aspects. If you're looking at even more active interventions to actually go in and start repairing different aspects of the climate system, then it's an even bigger task to ensure that you have explored all the unintended consequences and worked out the important ethical and governance aspects associated with that. So it's as a result of that complex intersecting picture that one of the areas that we are starting to focus on as Cambridge Zero is the whole area of climate repair, so that we are prepared and fully understand the implications of any possible intervention that we may need to make in the future.
Thanks, Emily. Celine, there's a really interesting question here from an alumnus of St. John's College. And this person is asking, quite bluntly, can democratic societies survive the choices that are required to address climate change? What I think the person means here is that politicians have to get elected, and to make the kind of really forceful policy changes that I think are going to be required may be democratically difficult. That's the question. Any observations on that?
Well, I think the question is quite valid because every country has its own governance system, and the ability of citizens to influence their own leaders varies in terms of the level of democracy in a given country. And just to give you one glaring example of the wrong kind of leader, the biggest emitter in the whole world for nearly the last century, the United States of America, has elected a climate denier. And that has enormously set back the global efforts to deal with this global problem, which he thinks is a hoax. Now, hopefully, we have an election coming up in the United States, and the people of the United States will see the need to elect leaders who will recognize this as a problem and will rejoin the global commitment under the Paris Agreement to take actions as needed. So it's a country by country approach. Every country is going to have to do what they can. Citizens of the country are going to have to keep their own leaders to the task and elect leaders who are going to take the right kinds of actions. I think Ella is absolutely correct. One of our big aspects of exerting our citizenship is getting the right leaders in place in our respective countries going forward. It's not going to be easy, but I think that that can be done, and I'm hopeful that it will be done.
Ella, do you share that optimism around the future of democratic societies in dealing with this from a perspective of a younger person in the UK?
I think I have to be hopeful because I want to go into working to address climate change. So I think I have to maintain hope. I personally want to go into policy. So I clearly see that there's a benefit to governance systems. I think what we've seen recently is the amazing school strikes and what can be done by those type of mass movements. And I think I have hope because we do see results from that and political institutions listening. So I think, yeah, I kind of have to feel hopeful is my answer.
And there may be, as you say, a tipping point that's happening here. It does seem to me, I must say, as if the social mood around these issues has changed dramatically, even in the last 5 years. A question for Helen from an alumnus of Queen's. It's quite direct. Are the companies that are hitting targets early only in the sectors that are, in a sense, easier to achieve targets? What about the companies in sectors that are really big greenhouse gas emitters? Are they doing well?
It's a very good question. It's probably true that the ones who've hit it early tend to be the big, some of them are the big tech companies who you think, well, what are they emitting? And they have these huge data centers. And are big emitters. And the RE100 campaign that I mentioned, in terms of hitting targets early, we only let companies into that when they have emissions over a certain size. So they're all big companies. They all have a certain level of emissions. So it's nothing for them to bring it down. But I think they're probably getting at, well, what about, oil and gas and the other big hard to abate sectors that I mentioned. Leave aside oil and gas for a minute. Where I have been impressed is we run something also called the EP100 campaign, which is energy productivity, and that's about energy efficiency. And that's a bit of it that doesn't get talked about very much. And that campaign is about doubling your energy productivity by 2030. And we thought it was quite interesting because we launched that, and there was some good sign-ups. It wasn't moving very quickly. And then we had a lot of actually Indian companies joining that are in harder to abate sectors like cement, and so on. And what they're looking at is, I mentioned you need the innovation and the processing end and how you actually make the products. So they were quite interested in energy efficiency in their processes because while we wait for the innovation over here, I'm horribly simplifying, but while we wait for the innovation over here, let's push on energy efficiency over here. And that's been good to see. So if you look at our campaigns, we've got a really good mix across lots and lots of different sectors, all multinationals of a certain size that have serious emissions and are working hard to bring those down. And we're pushing them hard to achieve those emissions reductions targets. I said leave aside oil and gas, I probably should bring them back in. As an organisation, we don't work directly with those companies at the moment, but we're starting to see some shifts. I'm not sure if I'd love to hear what others think about it actually, but I'm not sure if I'm at full optimism yet in some of those big companies and what they're doing. But there was a new announcement this week from BP or week before. I haven't had time to really look at it yet and think hard. But we're starting to see some shifts as the writing really gets onto the wall for fossil fuel companies. And I think it's going to be interesting. That's going to be the story of the next few years, is how that plays out and how those companies really turn themselves around.
Yeah, absolutely crucial. And lots of people are struggling to try to figure that out. I know we certainly are within the university. It's a constant subject of conversation. Celine, there are lots of questions about how vulnerable countries and the global south more generally can influence some of the worst emitters in the north more effectively through COP negotiations. Any sense of what you think the strategies are going to have to be going into the next COP for vulnerable countries?
Sure. So I'm one of the few people that has been to all 25 COPs that have happened so far. And so I have quite a lot of experience, not as a negotiator, but as an observer. I go there in support of the least developed countries, who, as I mentioned earlier, are a formal negotiating group of the poorest, most vulnerable countries in Asia and Africa. And one of the things that we hope to achieve in COP26, or two things, is firstly, to reinforce the message of increasing ambition to actually reach the 1.5-degree target that we all agreed in the Paris Agreement. We are not headed for 1.5 degrees. We are headed for well over 2 degrees. And so we need to be upping the ambition across the board for every single country going forward. But then at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, 2020 is a tipping point year in that we are now living in a climate change world. It's not something going to happen in the future. It's something that's already happening. And as a result, we are seeing right now, before our eyes, across the world, loss and damage from the impacts of climate change. Once you have loss and damage, there's no more mitigation, there's no more adaptation. You just have to suffer the loss. And poor countries are suffering a lot more loss than the rich countries, although even the rich countries, you mentioned the wildfire in Oregon. Oregon has 500,000 climate migrants who have to leave their homes because of the wildfire, which is attributable to human-induced climate change. So rich countries are not going to be left out of these kinds of loss and damage impacts. And that's something that we, the vulnerable countries, will be pushing the global leaders to address. They haven't addressed it yet. It's been a politically extremely sensitive issue because it involves issues like liability and compensation, which are taboo words for them. They don't want to accept that. But unfortunately, reality is going to force them to do that. And that's going to be a big contentious issue in COP26 coming up. And the vulnerable countries are going to push the big emitters, both the rich developed countries and some of the bigger developing country emitters like China and India as well.
Thank you. That's really insightful and interesting reflections on what's got to happen with COP. Ella, there's a lovely question here from an alumna of Clare, quoting, perhaps not surprisingly this week, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said, "Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." It's a great quote, I think. But the question is, how do you do that when there is this ecological catastrophe and the problem seems so huge? How do you bring people along while fighting for what really matters? Any thoughts on that? I mean, you talked about youth activism, etc. Is that going to bring people along, or is it going to alienate people? How do you approach that?
I think it's really important to normalize conversations about it. I think this is something that's when we're talking about youth, with the climate change movements, and also with the Black Lives Matter protests, I think it's been something that's been really coming out, I think, has been the importance to engage other people in dialogue, be that your family members, your friends. It shouldn't be something that you just do in kind of an academic context, or you kind of just read about on your own. It should be something we should talk to our friends, to our family about, and really normalize it in conversation, so it's something that is discussed and tackled.
Thank you very much. Now, I have to say the next question is not a plant. It is genuinely from an alumnus of Downing, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Emily. This person is saying that there are a lot of people with experience, knowledge, and resource who are listening and participating in this session. How can we help and support Cambridge Zero is the question, and this common mission. Who can we reach out to? Emily.
Oh, well, that is a good question, isn't it? Yeah. So one of the things that I have been saying for a while, as you know, Vice-Chancellor, is that we have an amazing alumni network that reaches all sectors of society and all countries of the world. And it feels to me as though if we are facing, which we are, a global challenge which will affect all sectors of society and all countries of the world. And as we have been saying, if we need all sectors of society and all countries of the world to be an important part of the solution, then our alumni network are an amazing resource that we should be looking to mobilize, and mobilize in a way that they, I think it comes back to some of the questions that we had earlier about what can you as an individual, I as an individual do, and we were saying that there were different things that we could do with our own, if you like, spheres of influence. So if we can find a way of mobilizing our alumni network in this common cause that we're spearheading from the university with Cambridge Zero, then I think we might really be able to start the right sort of scale of global movement that we need to address this challenge. So I don't think there's one single way of addressing it. For everybody, it will be different. But if people have ideas and would like to see how they can help us drive forward the Cambridge Zero mission, then do please get in contact with us, because we would be delighted to work out how we could collaborate to get the scale of change as rapidly as is required.
And so very practically, could I encourage you to look at the university's website, which has, of course, a page on Cambridge Zero, and you can see a little more detail about what is being planned. It's interesting. Emily and I were just having exactly this conversation yesterday about mobilizing the alumni network, and we are going to think hard about how to try to do that as effectively as we can. We have time for one short answer to a last question, and I'm going to ask you, Helen, whether you could address this. And that is, there has been evidence that we can pull together to address crises, and we've seen it with COVID. Is there anything that you think we've learned from the COVID crisis that would help us in mobilizing people and mobilizing governments? And I have to ask you to be quick, sorry.
Yeah, well, I think it is about being quick. I think we've, for too long, people have said, I always thought it was quite funny. People are like, change is so hard. And I think, yeah, but remember before we had mobile phones and they came along and changed our lives in no time at all. And didn't quite land as an example, but the idea that changes take decades, I think we've seen this year that you can change things very, very quickly. And I've been saying this to business leaders, like, don't tell me this is going to take years to get through your company when you just moved the whole workforce online in sort of 2 weeks. So I think what we've seen this year is that when lives are at stake with governments, and when there's existential threats out there to companies and livelihoods or societies, that we can move very quickly. And it is about willpower, it is about determination. And I think we can take a lot of those lessons from COVID and apply them to climate and the way we organize our societies and do the things that we need to do very quickly and know that change can happen fast.
Thank you very much. And I have to say that we've certainly seen the same thing at the university. Being able to pivot so quickly to go to online measurement and assessment, then online teaching for large lectures, now bringing students back, trying to sort out how we manage all of the buildings in a university in a COVID safe way. There's been a lot of nimbleness, and I think it's been shown across society. So I couldn't agree with you more, Helen. That's a great lesson from COVID. Emily, Salim, Helen, Ella, what a fascinating and I hope ultimately hopeful conversation. As a society, I think we've learned that we can make the choices that we need to make to eliminate, reduce, and then eliminate carbon emissions. We must do that. And we're nearing the end now of our 30th Cambridge Alumni Festival, 10 days featuring more than 100 sessions, more than 7,200 alumni and friends making bookings. Thank you all for joining us, for your engagement with Cambridge. I hope very much that we can invite you to visit us in person next year for the 31st festival, but this has been a great one. And in the meantime, please enjoy catching up with sessions that you may have missed on the Cambridge YouTube channel. We'll post as many as possible. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe.